On July 16, 1945, the USS Indianapolis loaded a top-secret cargo in San Francisco and made a record-setting run across the Pacific to deliver it. Components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima in less than a month. 14 days later, the ship that had just helped end the deadliest war in human history was at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and close to 900 of her crew were floating in open water, hundreds of miles from land, with no rescue coming, because nobody in the entire United States Navy had noticed the ship was missing. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis, the fastest sinking, the longest wait for rescue, and the only American captain court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action in the whole of the Second World War. The Indianapolis was not some obscure vessel. She was a Portland-class heavy cruiser that had served as flagship of the Fifth Fleet for much of the war, earned 10 battle stars, and carried Captain Charles McVay III, a career Navy officer who had commanded her since November 1944 through some of the toughest fighting of the Pacific Campaign, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. McVay came from a Navy family. His father had also been a rear admiral, and by every account from the men who served under him, he was a competent, well-regarded commanding officer, not the reckless figure the Navy's own court-martial would later paint him as. In mid-July 1945, he was given a mission unlike any other assignment of his career: carry the uranium core and firing mechanisms for the world's first operational atomic bomb from California to the American air base on the island of Tinian as fast as physically possible, under orders from General Leslie Groves and physicist Robert Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project team to proceed with all possible haste. She made the run in 10 days, a genuinely remarkable pace for the era, delivered her cargo, and continued on to Guam. From there, her orders were to proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, to join other ships preparing for the planned invasion of Japan. She left Guam on July 28, 1945, sailing alone. No escort had been assigned, a fact the subsequent investigation would return to again and again. Nobody informed Captain McVay that a Japanese submarine, I-58, was operating directly along his intended route. His standing orders were to zigzag at his discretion, weather permitting, a defensive maneuver meant to make a ship harder to target with torpedoes. On the night of July 29th, with visibility poor and no specific warning of danger in the area, McVay discontinued zigzagging at 8 o'clock in the evening. It was a judgment call made with incomplete information that would be treated very differently after the fact than it was in the moment. At 5 minutes past midnight on July 30, 1945, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Friend 58, fired a spread of torpedoes at the unescorted cruiser, having spotted her silhouette against the moonlight from several miles away. 2 of them struck home. One near the bow, one further aft, close enough to the ship's internal communications room to destroy nearly every telephone circuit and sound-powered system aboard within seconds. Fire tore through the forward section of the ship almost immediately, fed by aviation fuel stored for the ship's scout planes. Water poured in through the shattered hull, and Indianapolis began listing hard to starboard almost at once. The explosion had also knocked out the engine order telegraph, so the bridge couldn't even signal the engine room to stop. The ship kept driving forward at 17 knots, forcing water into the wound in her hull even faster than the damage alone would have. Captain McVay tried to get a distress message out. "We have been hit by 2 torpedoes. We are sinking rapidly and need immediate assistance." But with the ship's electrical power failing, that message likely never left the ship at all. Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes. Some ships take hours to go down, giving crews time to launch boats, organize survivors, and gather supplies. This one barely gave her crew time to react before she was gone. Of the 1,195 men aboard that night, roughly 300 went down with the ship in those first 12 minutes. The remaining 800 to 900 men went into the water, most with only a life jacket, some with nothing but a floating cargo net to cling to because there hadn't been enough time to launch anything more substantial. What followed was, by any measure, one of the worst ordeals suffered by any group of American servicemen in the entire war, and it had nothing to do with enemy action. It was the days that came after. Nobody came looking for them. Standing Navy policy at the time explicitly stated that arrival reports were not required for combatant ships, meaning that when Indianapolis failed to show up at Leyte Gulf on schedule, no alarm was raised anywhere in the chain of command. Later investigation revealed that at least a few distress signals may actually have reached shore stations that night, only to be dismissed. One station's watch officer was reportedly drunk on duty. Another had standing orders not to disturb a superior overnight regardless of the message's contents, and a third officer apparently assumed the transmission was a Japanese decoy meant to lure rescue ships into an ambush. Whatever the exact reasons, the result was the same. Indianapolis was gone, and for 4 days, as far as the United States Navy was concerned, she simply wasn't overdue. She wasn't even missing. Nobody was looking. For the men adrift in the open Pacific, those 4 days became a slow-motion catastrophe. The ship's senior surviving medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, later described watching young, otherwise healthy sailors give in to the thirst and drink seawater, not realizing what it would do to them, how it would send them into delirium within hours, how the diarrhea and dehydration that followed would finish what the salt water started, how men who had been rational and calm the night before would become, in his words, maniacal by the following afternoon. Haynes himself did what he could with nothing. No medical supplies, no clean water, nothing but his own hands and whatever floated nearby, moving between clusters of survivors, trying to keep the delirious from swimming off alone toward imagined islands or ships that weren't there, and burying the dead as best anyone could bury a body in open water. The ship's Catholic chaplain, Father Thomas Conway, spent his own remaining strength swimming from group to group, offering what comfort he could to the dying and the terrified, reportedly refusing to stop even as his own condition worsened, until the ordeal finally took him too, sometime before rescue arrived. Burned and wounded men, some horrifically injured by the explosion and fire, had no medical care beyond whatever their fellow survivors could improvise. The tropical sun blistered exposed skin during the day. The water turned bitterly cold at night. Groups of survivors, some numbering in the hundreds, drifted apart from each other as currents pulled them in different directions, meaning rescuers, when they eventually came, would find the men in scattered pockets across miles of open ocean rather than one contained area. And then there were the sharks. Oceanic white-tip sharks, drawn by the blood, the noise, and the sheer number of men in the water, began circling within the first day and never fully left. Estimates of how many men the sharks killed outright vary enormously, from a few dozen to well over 100, and historians still debate the true number. But every survivor account agrees on the psychological horror of it. The sound of a scream nearby, then silence, then the awful realization of what had just happened somewhere just out of sight. It became, in the years since, the most famous single detail of the entire ordeal, dramatized in films and books, even though most historians agree the majority of deaths in the water actually came from exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning rather than shark attacks specifically. The sharks were a constant circling terror. They weren't the main killer. The days themselves were. The survivors were finally found by accident. On the morning of August 2nd, 1945, the fourth day adrift, a Navy PV-1 Ventura on a routine anti-submarine patrol happened to spot what looked like an oil slick and a scattering of men in the water far below, nothing more than a lucky glance from a plane that hadn't been sent to look for them at all. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, radioed the sighting in, and within hours, a PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, arrived overhead. Marks made a decision that went against standard flying boat procedure, landing directly on the open ocean in swells that risked damaging the aircraft beyond any hope of taking off again, because he judged that men were dying faster than a surface ship could possibly reach them in time. His crew began pulling survivors directly out of the water and lashing the ones they couldn't fit inside the plane onto the wings with parachute cord, refusing to leave anyone behind as darkness approached. The overloaded aircraft eventually holding more than 50 men crammed inside and clinging to the outside. Destroyers, destroyer escorts, and other rescue ships raced to the area through the night and the following day, guided partly by Marks's radio reports of where survivor groups had been spotted. The last survivors weren't pulled from the water until just after midnight on August 3rd, when the destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle completed the search. Of the 1,195 men who had been aboard Indianapolis 5 days earlier, only 316 were still alive. It remains to this day the largest single loss of life from one ship's sinking in the history of the United States Navy. The Navy's response to this catastrophe was, in retrospect, almost as troubling as the disaster itself. Rather than examining the systemic failures that had left Indianapolis without an escort, without warning of a submarine in her path, and without anyone even noticing she was overdue, the Navy court-martialed Captain McVay in December 1945 on 2 charges: failing to order the ship abandoned in time, and hazarding his ship by discontinuing his zigzag pattern. He was acquitted of the first charge. He was convicted of the second, despite testimony offered at his own trial from Commander Hashimoto himself, the Japanese submarine captain who had actually sunk the ship, stating plainly that zigzagging would have made no meaningful difference to his ability to hit the target that night. McVay became the only commanding officer out of more than 700 American ships lost in the entire Second World War to be court-martialed for losing his vessel to enemy action. His sentence was eventually remitted by the Secretary of the Navy, but the conviction itself was never overturned during his lifetime, and the damage went far beyond his career. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz himself reportedly felt a simple letter of reprimand would have been sufficient punishment if any was warranted at all, a view that carried little weight once the Navy's public leadership decided a court-martial was necessary. Families of men who had died in the water blamed him personally, and some wrote to tell him so directly. One piece of mail that survived reportedly told him the family's holiday would have been merrier if he hadn't killed their son. McVay retired from the Navy in 1949, carrying both his own memories of the ordeal and the public verdict that he alone had been responsible for it. In 1968, at the age of 70, he took his own life. It took a 6th-grade student to finally set the record straight. In 1996, a Florida boy named Hunter Scott chose the sinking of the Indianapolis as his school history project, inspired partly by a scene in the film Jaws that referenced the disaster in passing. What started as a class assignment turned into a genuine historical investigation. Scott eventually interviewed nearly 150 surviving crew members and reviewed hundreds of pages of documents, concluding, with a rigor well beyond what any school project usually demands, that McVay had been made a scapegoat for failures that reached far above his own rank. His research reached Congressman Joe Scarborough, and from there, Congress itself. In September 1999, several Indianapolis survivors testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, sharing accounts that, in some cases, they had never spoken publicly before. In October 2000, Congress passed a resolution stating that Captain Charles McVay III was exonerated for the loss of his ship, and President Bill Clinton signed it into law. McVay didn't live to see it. He had been dead for 32 years by the time his name was finally cleared by the same institution that had spent 5 decades insisting he alone bore the blame. The wreck of the Indianapolis herself was found in August 2017, resting more than 3 miles down in the Pacific, exactly where the survivors' accounts had always placed her. Located by a private research expedition funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, using historical records and survivor testimony to narrow down the search area decades after the Navy's own post-war search efforts had come up empty. Today, the story is remembered as one of the deadliest naval disasters in American history, not simply for how many men died, but for how avoidable so much of it was, and for how long it took the institution responsible to admit that. The Navy has since acknowledged the systemic failures that contributed to the tragedy: the missing Escort, the withheld intelligence about the Japanese submarine, the arrival reporting policy that let a warship vanish for 4 days without anyone noticing, and has used the case in the decades since to reform how it tracks its own ships at sea. The men who survived those 5 nights in the water carried it with them for the rest of their lives. So did the man the Navy chose to blame for it, right up until the night he decided he couldn't carry it any longer. If you want to hear the full story of the mission that sent Indianapolis racing across the Pacific in the first place, the delivery of the atomic bomb that ended the war 2 weeks later, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.